A diplomatic exchange. Commander Vraxel Vaughn stood at the edge of the Human Military Academy's main training field, his four eyes scanning the scene before him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. As a decorated officer of the Zalzir Dominion, he had commanded legions in war zones across the stars, crushed rebellions, and orchestrated planetary invasions. His people were a warrior species, massive, exoskeletal beings whose strength and discipline had secured their dominance over countless lesser civilizations. Yet now, the Galactic Council had ordered an evaluation of the humans, a species that had recently made its presence known among the stars. There were whispers of their rapid expansion, their resilience, and their unconventional ways of war. Some claimed they were weak, barely more than upstart primates who had stumbled into spacefaring technology. Others warned that they were the most dangerous species to emerge in millennia. Vraxel intended to find out the truth for himself. Beside him, General Catherine Monroe, a tall, broad-shouldered woman with a crisp uniform and sharp blue eyes, motioned toward the field. We'll begin with a demonstration of our basic physical training. Vraxel chittered in amusement. Physical prowess? My kind are genetically engineered for combat. Strength alone has never been humanity's advantage, has it? Monroe smirked. No, but let's see what you think of what we do train for. The exercise began. The human cadets, lean, sweat-drenched figures, threw themselves at an obstacle course that seemed designed to break lesser beings. They scaled towering walls, dragged weights across the ground, and launched themselves over trenches with the agility of creatures half their size. Vraxel observed with mild interest. Their movements were impressive for a species with such a fragile frame, but nothing exceptional. He had seen species with superior musculature perform far greater feats. But then, the combat training began. A whistle blew, and pairs of cadets squared off in sparring matches. Vraxel focused on one fight in particular, a tall, muscular male facing a much smaller female opponent. By all logic, the male should have overpowered her instantly. Instead, she waited, watched. The moment he lunged, she twisted effortlessly around his attack, using his own momentum to send him crashing into the ground. Before he could react, she was on him, locking his arm into an unnatural angle. The male struggled, but his superior size and strength meant nothing. The moment he resisted, his own leverage worked against him. Vraxel's mandibles clicked in unease. This was not the brute force combat his people practiced. This was something else. Nearby, another match caught his attention. One cadet was pinned under his opponent, seemingly beaten, until he did something unexpected. He drove his forehead into the opponent's face, momentarily disorienting them. With no hesitation, he gouged at their exposed throat, not with a weapon, but with his fingers. Though the match was called before he could cause real harm, the sheer ferocity and ingenuity of the move sent a cold shiver down Vraxel's spine. Your warriors fight dishonorably, he observed, his voice carefully neutral. Monroe turned to him. No, Commander. They fight to win. Vraxel watched as the cadets continued, each demonstrating a level of ruthlessness and adaptability that made his exoskeleton itch. His people fought with rigid technique, following centuries-old strategies of dominance and overwhelming force. But humans fought like cornered animals, fast, brutal, and without hesitation. One cadet, barely standing, wiped blood from his lip and grinned at his opponent. He was losing, yet he was smiling. What is wrong with that one? Vraxel asked. Monroe chuckled. Oh, that? He's just having fun. Vraxel stiffened. Fun. His kind fought out of duty, for conquest, for survival, never for amusement. A cold realization crept over him. The humans enjoyed this. The pain, the challenge, the struggle. Vraxel's stomach churned. This was only their basic training. What kind of monsters did their actual warriors become? As the sun set over the academy, Vraxel remained silent, his previous confidence shaken. He had come expecting to find a weak species that had lucked into galactic relevance. Instead, he had found something far worse, something that loved to fight, and something told him this was only the beginning. The mind of a human soldier, Commander Vraxil Vaughn sat rigidly in the observation deck overlooking the war simulation chamber, his four-clawed fingers tapping against the metal armrest of his chair. His initial skepticism about human warfare had already begun to erode after witnessing their ruthless and unorthodox combat training. But now, he would see them tested where he truly believed his species held superiority, strategy, and tactics. The chamber before him was a massive, enclosed battlefield, a simulated war zone designed to test the minds of the Academy's brightest cadets. It was split into two halves. One team was assigned as defenders, tasked with holding key positions, while the other played the attackers, charged with breaching their fortifications. Each side had access to identical resources, limited supplies, and a clear objective. Simple, or so Vraxil thought. General Monroe stood beside him, arms crossed, as she watched the cadets move into position. "This is where humans shine," she said. "Not through sheer strength, not through numbers, but through adaptation and deception." Vraxil chittered in skepticism. Deception is a crutch for the weak. True strategy is about precision and superior force. Monroe smirked. "Let's see if you still think that by the end of this." The simulation began. The first move, the expected, turned unexpected. Vraxil expected the attackers to rush forward, utilizing cover to gradually push toward the objective. That was the logical approach. That was what every other species in the galaxy would do. Instead, the human cadets did something that immediately unsettled him. They sent a small squad charging forward in an obvious, reckless assault. It was an easily predictable maneuver. Too predictable. The defending team quickly focused fire on them, cutting them down almost immediately. A waste of lives. A foolish mistake. Or so Vraxil assumed. But then, alarms blared from the defending team's communication hub. Their automated defenses had been silenced. Their command channels were flooded with false orders. Vraxil's mandibles twitched. The reckless charge had been a sacrifice, a distraction. While the defenders focused on the blatant assault, a second team had infiltrated their systems, scrambling their communications, feeding misinformation, and even redirecting their own drone support against them. The defenders hesitated. Confusion spread like wildfire, and the moment they hesitated, the real attack began. The remaining attackers struck from an unexpected angle, taking advantage of the chaos they had created. The battle turned into an ambush within an ambush, with the defenders' own resources now working against them. Within minutes, the defending force was overrun. A total collapse. The rule of human warfare. Nothing is sacred. Vraxil felt something unfamiliar. Unease. His species, the Zalzir, believe in honorable combat, in overwhelming force and strategic precision. Every battle had clear rules. You fought with strength, claimed victory, and proved dominance. Humans, it seemed, did not care for such things. That was... Vraxil hesitated, trying to find the right word. Dishonorable. Monroe shrugged. That was effective. Vraxil turned toward her. Your cadets sacrificed their own to gain an advantage. They exploited their enemy's trust in standard tactics. They used deception rather than skill. Monroe raised an eyebrow. And yet they won. Vraxil struggled to form a response. The logic was undeniable. In every battle he had fought, he had relied on power, numbers, and calculated tactics. The humans? They relied on misdirection, unpredictability, and outright manipulation. And that terrified him. The final blow, a mindset built for war. The second simulation began, this time with the roles reversed, attackers becoming defenders. Vraxil leaned forward, expecting a standard defense strategy. Fortify positions. Control key choke points. Standard doctrine. Once again, the humans defied his expectations. Instead of forming rigid defensive lines, they abandoned key areas entirely, leaving gaps that looked like exploitable weaknesses. The attacking team took the bait, rushing in to claim the undefended positions, only to fall into a series of traps. The humans had anticipated their opponent's natural instincts and weaponized them. One squad was led into a dead end, where explosives detonated behind them, cutting off their retreat. Another was deliberately allowed to capture a key command point, only to find that the defenses they had counted on had been remotely reprogrammed to fire on them. The final team, thinking they had broken through the defensive line, was ambushed from underground, where the human cadets had secretly dug in. The result? Total defeat. Vraxel watched in silence as the attackers surrendered, completely outmatched. Monroe exhaled, turning to him. "What do you think now, Commander?" Vraxel didn't answer immediately. His thoughts were swirling. He had studied war his entire life. He had fought campaigns across the stars. And yet, in the span of 2 battles, these humans had shattered everything he thought he understood about warfare. Finally, he spoke. "Your people do not fight like soldiers. They fight like predators." Monroe grinned. "We fight to win. That's the only rule that matters." Vraxel clenched his jaw. If the Zalzir ever went to war with these creatures, it wouldn't be a contest of strength. It would be a test of survival. And he was no longer sure his people would survive it. Psychological warfare and the unbreakable spirit. Commander Vraxel Vaughn sat in uneasy silence as General Monroe led him through the winding halls of the Human Military Academy. The war simulations had disturbed him deeply. The way humans fought, without honor, without predictability, was unlike anything he had ever encountered. His people, the Zalzir, had built an empire on overwhelming force and calculated precision. Humans had built their military on chaos, deception, and sheer stubbornness. But the tour was not over. There was still more to see. "This next section," Monroe said, leading him through a reinforced door, "is where we train our cadets in psychological warfare." Vraxel stiffened. "Psychological warfare?" Monroe smirked. "Oh, Commander, you didn't think war was just about guns and soldiers, did you? The art of breaking an enemy without firing a shot." They entered a dimly lit room lined with screens. A group of cadets sat at terminals, their eyes locked onto digital battlefields where no direct combat was taking place. "Look here," Monroe gestured to one of the screens. "This is a simulated engagement. No bullets, no ships, no physical fighting. Just information." Vraxel leaned in. The cadets weren't targeting enemy soldiers. They were targeting their minds. One team was flooding enemy communications with false orders, causing confusion in the chain of command. Another was hacking into news feeds, spreading fabricated reports of defeats to lower enemy morale. A third was identifying key enemy officers and crafting personal attacks, leaking falsified documents to make them look incompetent, sowing distrust within their own ranks. Vraxel struggled to find the right word. "You make them doubt themselves. You turn them against one another." Monroe nodded. "A demoralized enemy fights worse. A paranoid commander makes mistakes. War isn't just about who has the bigger guns. It's about who believes they'll win." Vraxel's exoskeletal fingers tightened. This was disturbing in its brilliance. His people would never think to use war as a mind game. They fought with physical force. The humans fought by corrupting the very will of their enemies. And yet, this was only the beginning. Special forces, the humans who refused to break. Monroe led him deeper into the facility, down into a reinforced chamber. Here, a group of cadets stood at attention, silent, focused, and exuding an unsettling aura of discipline. "These," Monroe said, "are our Special Forces trainees. The best of the best." Vraxel observed them carefully. They were not the largest humans he had seen. In fact, some of them looked almost frail compared to the hardened warriors he had expected. Then Monroe turned to the instructor. "Give the commander a demonstration." The instructor nodded and turned to the cadets. "Interrogation exercise. No one breaks." Vraxel watched as the cadets were led into a darkened chamber, where bright lights and loud, disorienting noise filled the space. Simulated torture conditions. His people used similar methods to extract information from prisoners. The first cadet was dragged in, restrained in a chair. An interrogator, played by another instructor, stepped forward. "Tell us the location of your base," he demanded. The cadet just grinned. "Tell us," the interrogator repeated, turning up the simulated stress. Louder noise, flickering lights, controlled discomfort. The cadet laughed. Vraxil's mandibles twitched. They enjoy this? Monroe chuckled. They're trained to. The human mind is flexible, Commander. We teach them to endure suffering, to embrace it, to weaponize it. One cadet, a young woman with a lean build, was subjected to a simulated pain exercise. She took deep breaths, centered herself, and then started singing. Vraxil's hands clenched. This is madness. They should be breaking down, not singing. They're learning, Monroe said. The body has limits, sure. But the mind? The mind can keep going long after the body gives up. That's what makes humans dangerous, Commander. We don't stop just because it hurts. Vraxil turned to Monroe, his discomfort now bordering on fear. You train your people not just to endure suffering, but to embrace it. She nodded. Pain fades. Victory doesn't. The unbreakable spirit, a warning to the galaxy. Vraxil had seen enough. He turned sharply, striding back toward the exit. Monroe followed, arms crossed, watching him closely. You seem unsettled, Commander, she mused. Vraxil stopped, his towering frame looming over her. You don't fight like soldiers. You fight like monsters. Monroe tilted her head. No, Commander. We fight like humans. And if you ever find yourself on the other side of a war with us, you'll see exactly what that means. Vraxil inhaled slowly, his thoughts racing. He had expected to find a species unprepared for galactic war. Instead, he had found something far worse. A species that had turned suffering into a weapon. He needed to report this to the Dominion. The humans could never be allowed to become an enemy. Because if war ever came, they would not stop. Not until the last enemy fell. The final revelation. Commander Vraxil Vaughn stood at the edge of the Human Military Academy's highest observation deck, staring out at the sprawling complex below. He had seen enough. The brutal combat training, the ruthless strategies, the psychological warfare, and the unbreakable spirit of human soldiers. Everything he had witnessed contradicted what the Zalzir Dominion believed about war. He had arrived expecting to observe a primitive species still learning the basics of interstellar conflict. Instead, he had discovered a nightmare. General Monroe stepped beside him, her hands tucked behind her back as she gazed at the horizon. So, Commander, she said casually, what's your final assessment of our academy? Vraxil's mandibles clicked as he struggled to formulate a response. He had toured countless military academies across the stars, each one devoted to the art of war. But this was different. I came here believing humans were an inferior species, he admitted at last. That you had simply stumbled into power, gaining a place among the stars through luck rather than ability. Monroe smirked. And now, Vraxil exhaled slowly. Now I understand why the Galactic Council fears you. The breaking point. His mind replayed everything he had witnessed over the last 2 days. Their combat training. Humans didn't rely on brute strength. They used ruthless efficiency, adaptability, and a complete disregard for honorable combat. Their strategic mindset. They saw rules as suggestions, using deception, sacrifice, and psychological warfare to break their enemies before the battle even began. Their endurance. They had no fear of pain, no hesitation in suffering. They didn't just endure hardships, they embraced them. But there was one last thing Vraxil needed to understand. One final mystery that gnawed at his mind. Tell me, General, he said, turning to her. You fight with deception, brutality, and psychological warfare. You endure pain as if it is nothing. But why? Monroe arched an eyebrow. Why? Vraxil's claws curled against the railing. Other species fight for conquest. Some fight for survival. The Zalzir fight for dominance. But humans, you fight like something is constantly chasing you. He studied her, his 4 eyes narrowing. What is it that you fear? Monroe was silent for a long moment. Then she exhaled, her expression unreadable. You want the real answer, Commander? She asked. Vraxil nodded. Monroe turned toward him. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of generations. We fight like this because for most of our history, we were fighting each other. The true horror of humanity. Vraxil froze. Each other? Monroe nodded. Before we reached the stars, before we even thought about aliens, we fought amongst ourselves. Wars that lasted decades. Battles where millions died. Civilizations that burned because of ideology, resources, or nothing more than pure hatred. She looked away, as if seeing ghosts of the past. We wiped out entire cities with single weapons. We created machines designed to erase life on a planetary scale. We fought wars not just to win, but to make sure the other side didn't exist anymore. Vraxil felt an involuntary chill run through his body. He had assumed humanity was simply a ruthless species by nature. But this was something worse. They had become this way because they had been their own worst enemy for thousands of years. And yet, Monroe continued, her voice softer now. We survived. We adapted. And when we finally looked up at the stars, we realized something terrifying. She turned back to Vraxil, her blue eyes sharp. We realized that if we ever met something out there that was as dangerous as we were, we'd have to be ready. Vraxil clenched his jaw. So you fight, not for conquest, not for dominance, but because you assume the worst. Monroe's expression darkened. Because history has taught us the worst always comes. The final decision. Vraxil said nothing. He had faced death in battle. He had fought in planetary sieges. He had executed traitors and crushed rebellions. But nothing had ever terrified him like this revelation. Humans were not just warriors. They were survivors of their own self-made apocalypse. And worse, they had learned to enjoy it. A deep, gnawing certainty settled into his mind. If the Zalzir Dominion ever went to war with humanity, it would not be a war of conquest. It would be a war of extermination. And the Zalzir would lose. He turned sharply toward Monroe, his decision made. This tour is over. I must return to my people. Monroe nodded as if she had expected this. You're going to warn them, aren't you? Vraxil's mandibles clicked. Yes, I will advise that we avoid war with humanity at all costs. You are not an enemy we can afford to make. Monroe smirked, but there was no amusement in it. Only a quiet understanding. Smart choice, Commander. Vraxil gave one last glance at the academy, the place that had shattered everything he believed about warfare. Then, without another word, he turned and left. As the doors closed behind him, Monroe sighed, staring at the horizon once more. She had seen that look before. The look of someone who had seen the truth about humanity and wished they never had.